Hi, my name is Kelly Siderio, and my presentation is on non-binary genders and non-binary gender identity. Just to start with definitions, someone who believes that they have a non-binary gender identity is someone who does not identify exclusively as a man or a woman. Some people who identify as non-binary never identify as either gender, so never identify as a man or a woman, and believe that they either exist somewhere in between on the spectrum of gender or do not ascribe to the binary of gender itself and just identify as a person, not in relation to any gender. A cisgender person is someone whose sense of personal identity and gender identity corresponds with the sex they were born with. So for some statistics, there are 1.2 million people in the US that identify as non-binary. And I bring this up to show that this is not a identity or topic that is in an extremely small population. This is something that affects many people, and is definitely something that's important to think about and consider, especially for us as therapists. 76% of non-binary LGBTQ adults are between the ages of 18 and 29. Because our culture has more recently become more acknowledging and accepting of non-binary as a gender identity, many of the people who are taking that as part of their identity are on the younger side. Further, 89% of people who identify as non-binary live in urban areas. I think part of this is due to the fact that identifying as LGBTQ tends to be more accepted in more left-leaning urban areas as opposed to more rural areas. This allows people to self-identify in that way more readily in urban areas. We all know that the LGBTQ community experiences a lot of discrimination and biases from people in our culture. And there's no exception with folks who identify as non-binary. Just some examples of this are we know that banning books is a huge problem in our country right now. And 4 in 10 of the books that were banned in 2022 are LGBTQ related. So this just shows how much discrimination there is against people who identify as on the LGBTQ spectrum or as non-binary, and also just the fear surrounding even the concept of non-binary. Another bias is that the idea that children are too young to know their gender identity. Many people assume that because a person is a child, that they can't know how they will identify. And this prevents people from allowing children to discover their own identity, experiment with their own identity, and express themselves with an identity that feels true to them. Another bias that I think leads to discrimination is the historical developmental theories that rely on categorical and binary thinking. So, most childhood development and gender research was based on a binary model of gender identity. And this leads our culture to really only see development in a binary way and does not leave room for development on a spectrum regarding gender. Another bias is this idea that identity development is a linear process with a definitive end. So that would be exemplified in thinking that you start at one point in your identity development and you go through very specific phases in order, and you have a definite end, and it doesn't change after that. And this leads people to sort of see, okay, if you're born as with male genitalia, you'll go through a specific linear process and you will end with a male gender identity. And does not leave room for the fluidity of gender development, um, and the dynamic nature of it, and also does not leave room for people to experiment or to change over time. Thinking about the expression of gender identity is really important when we're thinking about people who identify as non-binary. Ways people can express their gender identity include their physical appearance, and that comes on a spectrum, right? So whether it's the way that the clothes that they wear, the way they wear their hair, their makeup, etc., to all the way to maybe taking hormone blockers or making physical changes to their body to make them feel more comfortable in their body. Another expression of gender identity is the use of pronouns. For people who identify as non-binary, sometimes they will identify with gender neutral pronouns like they, them, or they, their. And you can see as our culture progresses and becomes more accepting of non-binary identities, that in the corporate workplace, people will tag their emails with their name and their preferred pronouns to acknowledge that people might have different pronouns than they do. Other expressions of identity are, associating with a non-binary flag. The LGBTQ plus community has flag colors to indicate and express pride in their gender identities or their, sexual orientation identities. Also, using different slang words like NB to express non-binary is a way for people in that community to feel connected and sort of take ownership of their identity. And also, you'll also see the gender neutral honorific. So instead of Mr. or Mrs. or Miss, MX is a way to provide that formality without needing to choose a specific male or female gender honorific. It's also really important for us as therapists to think about LGBTQ and non-binary portrayals in the media. The media is how, children learn about the world and their culture. One of the ways, of course. But it's really important that children see themselves in the media and they see examples of all the possibilities of what they could be. So some character representations of non-binary are Odie in Madagascar, Taylor Mason in Billions. Some famous like actresses or singers, Miley Cyrus, Cara Delevingne, and Demi Lovato all identify as non-binary. And there are a number of WNBA athletes who identify as non-binary. So again, I think it's really important for kids to see themselves in the media. I mean, we see this with the most recent Little Mermaid film, and there's dozens of videos of Black young girls or Black children seeing a Black Little Mermaid and seeing how meaningful it is to them. And I could imagine that a child who does not identify as either gender or maybe identifies as non-binary, seeing a non-binary character or actor or actress, that it can be so meaningful for them and validating. Regarding official distinctions of gender, this is really important for us as therapists thinking about our non-binary clients. So in April of 2022, the X gender marker became available in passports for all US citizens. And just thinking about Pennsylvania, in 2020, you were then able to get an X gender designation on your state driver's license. And this is so important because it's official state and federal level validation of a person's gender identity. Thinking about legal protections and issues around non-binary gender identity. There are some protections from discrimination. Title VII protects against sex and gender discrimination, and Title IX does the same in schools. And then there's also the Fair Housing Act, preventing people from discriminating against people with certain identities when it comes to renting or selling houses. There are issues and lack of protection because application of Title IX is not always extended to non-binary people. And there's also no federal protection for bathroom use. And I think this really comes into play, especially in schools, where this battle is really being fought heavily, especially in red states right now. So I really wanted to share these quotes that were from some papers that I read, and they really bring to the fore some issues around gender binaries. So I'll read them out loud. Lack of visibility and cultural intelligibility of non-binary identities increases the difficulty for young people to embrace their gender identities. So this lack of visibility is what I was saying, where when kids are not seeing themselves portrayed in the world and in their culture, they're not able to embrace their felt identity. Further, cultural intelligibility means our culture's understanding and acceptance of people's identities. And these two things are really needed in our culture in order to support young people in their gender growth, development, and embracing of their identities. Second quote says, identities and experiences that exist outside of cis normativity are often pathologized and positioned as less legitimate. And I think there are a lot of communities that are making a lot of progress with this, but it's still a huge problem in our country, where if you have an identity or an experience that's not the norm or not cisgendered, often people will pathologize it, make it seem as if it's disordered or wrong, or make it seem less legitimate. And I think this is so damaging to both children and adults when your identity, what you identify as, is deemed pathological or illegitimate. So from my readings for this project and also my personal beliefs, is really a non-static view of gender. And I think this is what needs to be pushed in our culture and country in order to support people who identify as non-binary. Research shows, and I believe, that gender may be experienced contextually, meaning depending on the person's context, where they live, what's going on in their life, across the lifespan. And it's more fluid at certain times and more static at others, because gender really is dynamic and non-linear. Gender is a process of being versus, so I think the binary version of gender and the static version of gender sort of sees gender as a process of being, like you just are something, whereas a non-static view of gender sees gender as a continuous process of becoming. You are never finished with your gender identity journey, and it is a dynamic journey. I think there's need for research specifically on lived experiences of gender nonconforming development, so that we can have a better basis for understanding people that have non-binary gender identities and experiences. So for my personal practice, these beliefs influence how I accept and validate my clients who have a non-conforming gender identity to the norm, right? I do believe that gender is a spectrum, dynamic, fluid, and very personal. I strive to have unconditional regard and acceptance for every part of my clients, especially their gender identities. And for me and my self-discovery, this project helped me look back at my personal childhood gender experience. And I really wish that I had more varied role models regarding gender identity. I believe that if I were growing up in today's climate in my same area, because it's different depending on where you live, that I would identify as a non-binary person. And I do believe that now that I'm adult, my gender identity is a little more solid, and I've identified with being a woman, but I do have a partial identification with the non-binary gender. And here are my references. Thanks so much for listening.